Welcome back to another deep dive. Our mission, as always, is pretty simple. Take those big, complex topics, boil them down to what you really need to know, and hopefully give you those aha moments. Today, we're diving into something really intricate, definitely vital, and often, frankly, quite tough: the dynamics of ethnic conflicts.
That's right. And our goal here is to sort of peel back the layers. We'll be drawing on academic ideas, sure, but also looking at some really compelling real-world examples. Think of this as, well, a shortcut to getting a solid handle on something that genuinely shapes societies all over the globe.
Exactly. And the big questions we're tackling are, how do groups with different cultures actually manage to live together? And what pushes those relationships over the edge into conflict? And then, importantly, how do societies try to, well, manage or even fix these really deep-seated tensions? So, okay, let's unpack this a bit before we even get into the conflicts. What is ethnicity, really? Is it just like a group of people, or is there more to it?
That's a great place to start because, yeah, the everyday understanding can be a bit thin. The word itself, ethnicity, it comes from the Greek ethnos, means nation or culture.
Hmm.
And it's crucial to separate this from race, which, we understand is more of a social construct. Ethnicity is really about a group sharing a culture, a sense of themselves, often some political awareness. They see themselves as a distinct community, usually tied to a place.
Okay, so shared culture, sense of self.
But it's not static. Thinkers like T.H. Erickson point out that ethnicity kind of emerges in the relationships between groups, especially when they see themselves as different, and often when there's a power hierarchy involved. Andrew Cohen adds that this really comes into focus when these different groups are living under the same system, same laws, same territory. That's when the differences can really sharpen.
Right, so it's about how groups see themselves, and maybe just as importantly, how they see each other, particularly when power enters the picture. Does that mean diverse societies are always going to have friction?
Not automatically. We can sort of differentiate between what we call pluralistic and multicultural societies. In a pluralistic one, you've got groups living side by side, maybe tolerating each other, but there's often still a hierarchy. That can lead to feeling marginalized, tension building up. Think India, maybe lots of recognized identities, but power imbalances can still cause problems. A truly multicultural society ideally goes further. It's not just tolerance, it's genuinely appreciating the diversity. That tends to reduce the hierarchy-driven tension. The idealized U.S. aims for this, though it's obviously a work in progress.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so if it's about these relationships and perceptions, what are the essential building blocks? What actually makes a collection of people feel like a people, an ethnic group?
Michael E. Brown gives us a really useful checklist, sort of. 6 criteria. First, a name. A clear way the group refers to itself and how others know them. Second, common ancestry. Now, this can be a shared belief, maybe even mythical, like Rajputs tracing roots back to Maharana Pratap. It creates solidarity. Third, shared belief. This means collective stories, history, narratives, maybe even myths or propaganda that bind people together.
Okay, name, ancestry, shared stories.
Fourth, shared culture. Enough common ground, language, religion, customs, maybe caste, so people within the group can communicate effectively, feel connected. Fifth, territorial attachment, a sense of belonging to a specific place, often really emotional, even if not everyone lives there now. And sixth, and this is absolutely key, group awareness, a sense of belonging. Individuals themselves have to feel they're part of the group. They have to personally identify with it.
Ah, that personal identification part. That leads to something interesting. Our identities aren't just one thing, are they? They feel more layered, more fluid sometimes.
Exactly. Which brings us to the idea of ascription versus self-ascription. Ascription is what you're born into, maybe your caste, your religion. It's kind of inherited. Self-ascription is the identity you choose to own, to emphasize, maybe even the one you'd fight for.
So you can have multiple identities at once.
Definitely. Think about it. You could be, say, Bihari, Hindu, Rajput, and a teacher, all at the same time. Most days, these identities are what we call latent. They're there, but in the background. But then something happens, a trigger, maybe a communal riot or a new government policy that affects one specific group. Suddenly, one of those identities becomes manifest. It jumps to the forefront.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, potentially dangerous. If identities are fluid, context dependent, what
Right.
pushes them to manifest in ways that actually lead to conflict? What flips that switch?
Often, it starts with something called ethnocentrism.
Yeah.
W.G. Sumner wrote a lot about this. It's this basic human tendency to see your own group as the center of everything, the standard. And this leads to what he called double moral standards. You judge your own group's actions differently, more favorably than you judge outsiders. This fuels stereotypes, generalizations, prejudice, a feeling that your group is superior.
Seeing your own group as the best, judging others harshly.
And tied to this is Frederick Barth's concept of ethnic boundaries.
Yeah.
These aren't lines on a map. They're imaginary lines, sometimes marked by visible things like clothing or symbols that we use to tell us from them. Crucially, Barth stressed these boundaries are socially constructed. We create them through our actions, our interactions. And because we create them, they can also be flexible and fluid. Well, depending on the situation, the boundaries can shift. A caste identity might become less important than a religious identity if there's a religious conflict brewing. Or maybe a shared religious identity gets overshadowed by a regional identity if everyone in the region feels threatened by an outside group. The lines aren't fixed.
Okay, so we have this complex picture of identity fluid, relational, influenced by ethnocentrism and these shifting boundaries. Now let's bring in Michael E. Brown again. You mentioned his framework for why conflicts erupt. He makes a key distinction, right?
He does, and it's incredibly helpful for analysis. Brown separates conflict causes into two main types. First, the underlying causes. These are the long-term chronic issues simmering beneath the surface, the deep roots of tension. Second, the proximate causes. These are the immediate short-term events, the triggers, the sparks that ignite the tinderbox created by those underlying issues. And Brown says you really need both for conflict to break out.
Right, the tinderbox and the spark. So what are those deep-seated underlying issues, the ones that can fester for generations?
Brown points to four main categories. First, structural factors. This often relates to the state itself. Weak states, failing states, states that just can't manage ethnic diversity effectively. Think about states created after colonialism, sometimes drawing lines on maps that ignored existing ethnic or political realities. Like the partition of India and Pakistan, very hasty, didn't count for deep divisions, leading to a lack of ownership among people.
So the very structure of the state can be a problem. What else?
Second, political factors. This is huge. It includes things like minorities being shut out of decision-making, authoritarian regimes that might see minorities as a threat, leading to policies of forced assimilation or worse. China's treatment of the Uyghurs is often cited here. It also includes exclusionary political ideologies, and importantly, political leaders using tactics like scapegoating minorities, using hate speech, manipulating the media, especially around elections.
Okay, structural and political issues. What about the economy?
Third, economic and social factors. Big ones. Things like economic slowdowns, stagnation, or outright collapse. These crises often hit harder along existing lines of inequality, creating what's called relative deprivation. Minorities feeling they're getting a raw deal compared to others. Discriminatory economic policies that favor the dominant group are also key. We see this in Sons of the Soil movements like in Maharashtra, where during job shortages, there's a push against migrants, sometimes leading to violence or exodus.
Makes sense. And the last underlying cause.
Fourth, cultural and perceptional factors. These can be really insidious. Stereotyping ethnic groups, think of the jokes or assumptions made in movies like Two States about Tamils and Punjabis, but applied with real negative consequences. Also, cultural and linguistic discrimination, like the Gorkhaland issue, partly fueled by making Bengali compulsory in schools in that region. These things build deep grievances, resentment, distrust over time.
So those four: structural, political, economic, social, and cultural perceptional, they create the tinderbox. Then what provides the spark? What are Brown's proximate causes?
Again, he identifies four main types of triggers. First, internal mass-level problems, or what he calls bad domestic problems. This could be widespread economic hardship, think floods, droughts, major recessions, mass layoffs, or sudden political changes or policies that affect a large chunk of the population negatively. You could argue the CAA NRC policies in India fit here. While intended to address certain issues, they undeniably tapped into and inflamed existing Hindu-Muslim tensions, sparking major protests and unrest.
Okay, so widespread problems affecting many people. What's next?
Second, internal elite factors, or bad leaders. This is when political figures or other influential people deliberately exploit those existing mass-level problems. They invoke ethnic identity, stir things up, often for their own political gain, even if ethnicity isn't the root cause of the problem itself.
So leaders fanning the flames for their own benefit.
Precisely. Third, external mass-level problems, or a bad neighborhood. This is about spillover effects. Radical politics, violence, or major events in a nearby country impacting the situation next door. For instance, atrocities against Hindus in Bangladesh sometimes lead to reactions or boycotts in India.
Right.
The Rohingya crisis in Myanmar created huge pressure on Bangladesh, and the massive influx of refugees from Bangladesh in 1971 definitely triggered ethnic conflicts in northeast India as resources became strained and demographics shifted.
Right. Problems bleeding across borders. And the final trigger.
Fourth, external elite level factors, or bad neighbors. This is more deliberate interference. A regime in one country might actively support insurgent groups or create policies aimed at destabilizing a weaker neighbor. Think of allegations of China supporting insurgencies in India, for example. It also includes ethnic groups within a country seeking international support, trying to get their cause onto a bigger stage. The Khalistan movement gaining a significant voice in places like Canada is an example of leveraging external elite attention.
This framework of underlying and proximate causes is really helpful for breaking things down. But now, the really tricky part, perhaps. Why do individuals, actual people, choose to participate in these conflicts? It invites some serious critical thinking, doesn't it? What are the main theories trying to explain this?
Absolutely. It shifts the focus from broad causes to individual motivations. There were three main theoretical camps here. First, there's primordialism. Thinkers like Clifford Geertz are associated with this. The core idea is that ethnic identity is deep, innate, almost natural, fixed, permanent, like an extended family tie, rooted in evolutionary needs for group survival. Almost genetically encoded, some might argue. So from this view, ethnic conflict in diverse societies is seen as almost inevitable. Driven by these ancient hatreds or inherent animosities, Walker Connor famously said, "Man is a national, not a rational animal," meaning emotions tied to identity often trump logic.
Inevitable ancient hatreds. But that feels a bit too simple, doesn't it? If it's ancient and inevitable, why do we see places live peacefully for ages and then erupt? Or why does conflict happen in one city but not another nearby one with similar groups?
Exactly. And those are the major criticisms of primordialism. It struggles to explain spatial variation, why riots flare up repeatedly in, say, Ahmedabad, but rarely in Surat. Same groups, different outcomes. It also can't really explain temporal variation, those long periods of peace suddenly shattered by violence, like in the former Yugoslavia, or between Azerbaijan and Armenia. If the hatred is ancient, why isn't the conflict constant? And it definitely fails to explain Sons of the Soil movements, where you have conflict between groups like Marathas and Biharis in Maharashtra, who didn't even have significant contact, let alone ancient hatred, before recent migrations. Critics say it's an institution-free, politics-free view that ignores the context.
Okay, so primordialism has some big holes. What's the next theory?
The second main approach is instrumentalism. Scholars like Paul Brass are key here. This view argues the opposite. Ethnic identity isn't natural, it's socially constructed, it doesn't have inherent value, it's used as a tool. It's seen as a strategic resource, a means to an end, usually political power or economic advantage. Elites, in this view, consciously manipulate ethnicity. They create myths, narratives, symbols to mobilize people for their own gain. It heavily emphasizes self-ascription, choosing which identity to play up.
Okay, that makes more sense in explaining how politicians might use ethnicity. But if it's all just cynical manipulation by elites, why do ordinary people go along with it? Why risk their safety, their lives, if the main benefit goes to the leaders? Doesn't quite add up, does it?
That's the core challenge for pure instrumentalism. It bumps up against the collective action problem. Why would individuals, each with their own worries and interests, join a movement if the payoff mainly goes to the elites? And related to that is the free rider problem. Logically, many individuals might prefer to let others do the dangerous work protesting, fighting, while hoping to still get the benefits, like, say, job reservations, if the group succeeds. If everyone thinks like a free rider, then mobilization shouldn't happen.
Right. So instrumentalism explains the manipulators, but not necessarily the motivations of the manipulated. So what's the third way?
The third approach, often seen as an improvement or synthesis, is constructivism. It agrees with instrumentalism that identities are socially constructed, fluid, and yes, elites do try to manipulate them. However, constructivism adds back the crucial element of individual agency and meaning. It argues that while identities are constructed, individuals aren't just puppets. They actively participate in constructing and negotiating their identities, and they choose to emphasize certain identities based on their own perceived self-interest. This could be about economic survival, seeking social dignity, achieving political goals. It helps explain why only some people from an ethnic group might get involved in a conflict, those who see a personal benefit or necessity in participating.
So constructivism blends the idea of social construction with individual motivation and choice. That feels more nuanced. Now, when these factors, the causes, the triggers, the motivations converge and peaceful options fail, we see violence. But you mentioned it takes different forms.
Yes, collective violence in ethnic conflicts isn't monolithic. Scholars identify several main forms. First, riots. These are usually clashes between two ethnic groups. The implication is often that the groups have some level of comparable power, or at least aren't completely mismatched. The state might be biased, but it hasn't totally abandoned its role.
Okay, clashes between groups. What else?
A much darker form is a pogrom. This term usually signifies a massacre of a minority group that is either state-sponsored or openly tolerated, even encouraged by the state authorities. The 1984 anti-Sikh riots in Delhi are often categorized this way, pointing to state complicity or deliberate inaction. The Holocaust is the ultimate horrific example.
A terrifying distinction. Then there's
Third, civil war. This is when an ethnic group takes up arms specifically against the state itself. The government becomes a direct combatant in the conflict. Think of Syria or many of the long-running insurgencies in northeast India where groups are fighting the Indian state.
right. What about smaller scale violence?
That brings us to lynching. This is typically brutal, targeted violence where a mob, usually from the dominant group, attacks and kills one or a few members of a minority group. We know the terrible history of racial lynching in the U.S. We also see cases in India, sometimes involving migrants from the Northeast or Africa, for instance. And finally, terrorism. In this context, it can be seen as almost the inverse of lynching. A small, often extremist faction from a minority group carries out attacks against the majority population or symbols of state authority. The aim is often to inflict mass casualties, spread fear, and challenge the state's power.
Riots, pogroms, civil war, lynching, terrorism, a grim spectrum. Let's try to bring these frameworks alive now by looking at India. It's such an incredibly diverse place, these dynamics must play out constantly. How do Brown's causes and triggers show up in specific Indian conflicts?
India is indeed a complex laboratory for this. Let's take the Kashmir conflict. The underlying causes run deep. The 1947 partition itself created a unique situation. A Muslim-majority region ruled by a Hindu Maharaja joining India with a significant Hindu Kashmiri Pandit minority. Then, land reforms in the 1950s under Sheikh Abdullah, while aiming for equity, ended up marginalizing many Pandits economically, leading to an early voluntary exodus. Through the 60s, 70s, 80s, there was a growing separatist sentiment and also tendencies towards Islamization, which increasingly framed the Pandits as outsiders, not truly belonging.
So decades of simmering historical, political, and social issues.
Exactly. Then came the proximate causes, the triggers. The 1987 state elections are almost universally cited as a turning point. Widespread allegations of rigging led to massive frustration, simply among youth who felt cheated. Some candidates who lost went on to become major militant leaders. And then an external elite factor, the end of the Soviet war in Afghanistan around 1989. Pakistan's ISI, it's widely argued, redirected battle-hardened, U.S.-funded Mujahideen fighters towards Kashmir. This dramatically escalated the violence, leading to targeted killings of Pandits and that infamous ultimatum, Ralev, Galev, Yachalev, convert, die, or leave.
A tragic convergence of internal grievances and external manipulation. What about another example, maybe from the Northeast?
Let's look at the Bodo land issue in Assam. Again, deep underlying causes. The Bodos, a major tribal group, felt culturally and politically subordinated by the dominant Assamese culture for decades. They were asking for reservations way back during the Simon Commission in 1929. By the 1960s, fears for their cultural identity led to demands for a separate state. Add to that a lack of economic development in Bodo majority areas and, critically, land alienation. Over time, settlements of non-Bodo Assamese, but especially Bengali-speaking Muslims, put pressure on traditional Bodo lands, creating a sense of existential crisis.
Survival and identity threat. And the trick.
A major proximate cause was the massive influx of Bangladeshi migrants, particularly after the 1971 war. This influx, largely of Bengali-speaking Muslims, intensified the pressure on land and resources in Bodo areas. Tensions simmered and then exploded into major ethnic violence, especially around 2012, resulting in hundreds killed and massive displacement. This also fueled Bodo militancy.
These really are complex, deeply human stories. Decades of issues, then a specific event lights the fuse. It really shows how history and immediate events intertwine. So given these volatile situations, how do states, especially diverse ones like India, actually try to manage all this? What are the responses?
Well, states have a range of tools, and honestly, some are pretty brutal. Historically, odd even today, some states try assimilation, basically forcing minority groups to adopt the dominant culture, language, education, customs. Think of China's policies in Tibet and Xinjiang, pushing Mandarin, suppressing local language and religion, their education camps for Uyghurs. If assimilation doesn't work or isn't the goal, states might resort to expulsion, forcibly driving a minority group out of the territory. Myanmar's actions against the Rohingya Muslims are a stark recent example, and the most extreme state response is genocide, the deliberate, systematic mass killing of an entire ethnic or cultural group like the Holocaust.
Those are the oppressive tactics. How do minority groups push back when facing these pressures or even just feeling marginalized?
Their demands often escalate. They might start by demanding autonomy, more self-governance within their region, control over local affairs. India has responded to this by creating new states like Jharkhand and Telangana, largely along ethnic or tribal lines, or granting special autonomous status, especially in the Northeast. If autonomy demands aren't met or aren't seen as enough, the demand can escalate to secession, wanting to break away entirely and form an independent state. Some Naga groups in the Northeast have held this demand for decades, and when political channels seem blocked, groups may resort to insurgencies, armed rebellion against the state.
So it's this constant push and pull. How does India specifically navigate this? You mentioned creating states, but what's the overall approach?
India's approach is often described as multicultural, or at least aiming for it. It's a complex balancing act. There are strong constitutional safeguards articles, 25 to 30, guarantee religious, cultural, and educational rights for minorities. The 5th and 6th schedules provide special protections and autonomous zones for tribal areas. There are dedicated institutions, like ministries for minority affairs and tribal affairs. On the ground, there's often a policy of trying not to interfere too much in local customs, alongside creating autonomous district councils with real powers. There's legal recourse. Minority and tribal groups can directly petition the Supreme Court if they feel their fundamental rights are violated. And importantly, there are significant affirmative action reservations in education and government jobs, special schools, scholarships, financial aid, skill development programs, all aimed at bridging historical gaps and promoting inclusion. It's not perfect, implementation varies, but the framework is quite comprehensive.
That does sound multifaceted, trying to balance unity with diversity. How does this compare to how other major powers handle their own minorities? What do we see elsewhere?
It varies wildly. Look at China. It officially recognizes 56 ethnic groups, but the reality is overwhelming Han Chinese dominance. Those autonomous regions for minorities like Tibetans and Uyghurs, largely symbolic in terms of real power. The state pushes Mandarin education, uses intense surveillance, and actively suppresses distinct cultural and religious practices. It's a very top-down assimilationist model, often coercive. Or take Russia, especially looking back at the Soviet era after the Tsars. Stalin's policies involve forced assimilation, relocating entire ethnic groups, seizing indigenous lands for industrial projects like oil extraction, forcing children into Russian-language boarding schools. It led to the devastation of many indigenous cultures and languages, hundreds facing extinction. Again, a very forceful attempt to impose uniformity. The United States offers another contrast. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under law. Native American tribes are recognized through treaties as semi-sovereign nations, living on reservations with some degree of self-governance, overseen by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The U.S. approach to affirmative action is different from India's quotas.
It's more of a preferential boost, targeted funding for tribal colleges, health services, cultural programs. Tribes also have significant rights to sue under federal law, plus there's a strong element of encouraging corporate diversity initiatives. So it's more based on legal rights, targeted support, and tribal sovereignty rather than explicit quotas across the board.
Fascinating comparison. So we've covered a huge amount today in this deep dive. We started by really unpacking what ethnicity means, moving beyond simple definitions to see it as relational, constructed fluid. We looked at the complex web of underlying causes, structural, political, economic, cultural, that create the potential for conflict, and the proximate triggers domestic problems, bad leaders, neighborhood effects, external meddling that light the fuse. We explored the theories trying to explain why people participate, from innate ancient hatreds and primordialism to elite manipulation and instrumentalism to the more nuanced view of constructivism emphasizing individual agency and self-interest. We touched on the grim realities of ethnic violence riots, pogrom, civil war, lynching, terrorism. And finally, we examined how states respond from brutal suppression like assimilation or expulsion to more accommodating approaches like autonomy, and compared India's multifaceted strategy with the very different models in China, Russia, and the US.
And if you connect all these dots, you start to see that understanding these dynamics isn't just an academic exercise. It's really crucial for making sense of world events, for understanding social movements unfolding around us, for appreciating why identity and belonging are such powerful human forces. It allows you, hopefully, to apply some critical thinking, to look past the easy headlines or simplistic explanations and see the deeper, more complex factors at play.
Absolutely. Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. Thinking about everything we've discussed, the fluidity of identity, the mix of deep-seated grievances and immediate triggers, the blend of emotion and rational self-interest, how might this change the way you think? How might recognizing these complexities change how you interpret news reports about conflicts happening somewhere else in the world? Or maybe even how you understand and interact with the diverse groups in your own neighborhood or community? Something to chew on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.